Chapter Alpha. Falling is an interesting sensation. It's a terrifying one, but still interesting. They have whole lectures in college to teach about how things fall, computer games that simulate the physics of falling, and shining Hollywood studios where underpaid stunt actors would perform carefully controlled falls onto soft mats for big budget action movies. From the short, flashing movement of a trip that would end with an uncomfortable landing to a prolonged descent lasting moments that would stretch away, lasting longer than they have any right to do so. All different types of falling can be an interesting experience for various reasons. Most people might consider those longer falls a terrifying experience, enough to induce nightmares about them as a common trope. But if you can focus and really think about the process of falling, you will know that it is only the last moment which is actually something to fear, while everything before that can be something to enjoy. She was not focusing on that thought, though, and just like the majority of the human race, her only thought was of the terror of falling. Fear that was crowding out any space for more coherent thought for the time being. A small part of her did question how she came to be falling from nowhere, but it was having a hard time being heard over the screaming. She spun end over end, the scream dragging out of her, spinning over and over seemingly without end, until by luck more than skill, she steadied herself and slowed her spin, going to face down, finally giving her chance to focus on more than the flailing limbs, screams and rushing air that was her world at this precise time. Seconds ticked past as she continued to fall, until a new thought wormed its way into her mind. Where is the ground? The thought rattled around, squeezing through the fear until it finally made enough room for itself to be heard. She looked to her left and right, before pulling her eyes back down, but all she could see, horizon to horizon, was nothing but a light blue hue, as far as she could see, fading away to pitch black below her. The oddness of it was enough to act as a crowbar in her thoughts, knocking the fear to the side long enough as she took this in. This can't be right, was all her mind offered. It did not look like anywhere on Earth she could imagine. If there was nothing below, then what was above? She tried to look up, but that turned out to be a mistake, and the fear returned in full force as she resumed the spin, over and over, flailing, trying to get a grip on the air around her. Even in the grip of fear, the human mind can grasp small details which it might not realize at the time, but tucked away for consideration later, and her mind did notice how the air felt wrong. If she had had any previous experience with skydiving, she might have realized it sooner, but jumping out of planes for fun was not featured highly on her list of things to do. Gradually the spin slowed and she found herself on her back, facing what she thought was up, and was blinded by the light above as she opened her eyes. A circle of pure white glowed above, but getting smaller as the moments continued to click by. The blinding light was too much to look at, and she looked away as the moments came and went past. Having overstayed its welcome, the fear began to recede once more, allowing her to think slightly more clearly. Where am I? Well, there was no clue on that. An empty blue void is not much to go by. Why am I falling? Well, gravity does that, so that is normal at least. When did I fall? This seems to be going on for an unreasonably long time. Am I still scared? Yes, that was an easy one. And to test it, she puffed out her chest and let out a scream to confirm it. How did I get here? It might have been the terror, but this was not something which there was an answer to, and trying to think about it left a blank, scratchy feeling in her mind. Before she could think more on that, though, she realized things were changing around her at an increasing rate. The bright disk above was beginning to reduce in size faster and faster, and the air around her beginning to descend from its light blue down to an inky blackness. She let out another scream for good measure, sure that this fall would not last much longer, and that the inevitable final moment was soon approaching, surely to end her life in an instant. No one could survive something like this ride. It didn't seem likely, especially with how long she had been for. The train of thought cut off suddenly as she stopped falling. For all the interesting things about falling that there were to consider, in this case, the most interesting thing was not how much it hurt to land. It was the simple idea that she was not falling anymore and had survived. And as she slipped into the almost welcome embrace of unconsciousness, the only thought she had was, never again. She snapped awake. Was it all a dream? Was she back home in a comfy bed after all, just having nightmares after one too many sweets in the evening? That thought vanished as quickly as it came, as she opened her eyes to see the bizarre landscape about her. Around her, a black void stretched, neon green-blue lines spreading out in a grid around her as far as she could see. It was not completely flat, and on occasion forming curves in the land, for want of a better word. The overall result, though, looked like a mess of blending lines in the far distance, but a perfectly flat, regular grid around her. One thought nudged its way into her confused mind, calling for attention. It was a simple one that most people would ask in a similar situation. Where am I? Here and there, dotted across the landscape, were strange shapes protruding from the ground, too far to make out what they were clearly. The pain of landing had faded, and her body had stopped hurting, but the memory of pain was still there, reminding her it could be back. Getting up with a jolt, her eyes locked onto the nearest landmark, which almost looked like a distorted and half-built suburban home. She knew that home. It was one she'd seen hundreds of times before in the past, and built herself, and spent hours pulling down and putting up again, trying to find the best layout she could. It was a home she'd built in a video game. That sparked a new thought for her. How did I get here? This one was harder to answer though. The memories, unlike that of the house, were slow to form and the moments ticked by, her brow creased trying to remember the recent past. There had been a headset ride, something about putting it on, waiting for the thing to turn on, and then something else. That thought hurt, but at least it gave her something to try. Take off the headset. Closing her eyes, she pictured the headset on her head and raised her hands to where it would be, slowing her breathing as she did. Just grasp the edges of it and lift. She opened her eyes, hoping beyond hope to now be looking at something more familiar, maybe a bedroom or office cubicle perhaps. The My Sims house sat there, mocking her in a way that inanimate objects can only do. She let out a howl of frustration and clawed at her head. She had to get this damn thing off and get things back to normal. Get out of here and... It was at this moment she finally saw her hands. Her blocky, wireframe hands. The scream carried an impressive distance across the grid landscape. Crap, 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 crap! What the frick is happening to me? She clawed her way back, staring at her hand, gibberish expletives flowing from her mouth as the reality of what she was seeing overpowered any sense of reason. This can't be real, she repeated over and over, but as she stared and the fingers moved before her eyes as she felt the move, clear that these were her hands. Each hand was made up of simple, blocky polygons, with balls on every joint, the left hand green and the other blue. These were something that looked like a default rigging model she would use to design with when creating a character model for a project of work, so that she could make it move. To see them moving as her own hands was not something her overstressed mind could handle. Looking down, she could see what seemed to be a cylindrical oval body, long and white, but sticking out from below. Her feet sat there on the floor, mocking her in their low detail polygon state, blue and green to mirror her hands. As she fell over, once again trying to retreat from her own feet, she struggled to comprehend what was happening to her. Her body was horribly changed. She was in a strange and unfamiliar place, and arrived here by means unknown. There were too many questions and no answers. Her eyes unfocused, and she started to shake uncontrollably, before strangled sobs choked out into the silent landscape that surrounded her, and she curled into a fetal position, at a loss for anything else to do. She lay there, letting out her misery for the void to hear, as the sobs racked through her. It took time, but slowly her sobs dwindled to a whimper, and she lay there, exhausted and unwilling to move. It had not helped, and now there was nothing but a cold, aching void where her heart should be. She had to get out of here. Staggering up with legs that felt unfamiliar and looked stranger, she made her way over to the house in the distance, trying to find something, anything, to give her a clue as to what she could do next. Maybe there was a way out, someone to help her. Even a comforting, familiar place would do at this point. As she mounted the front porch of the house, more details of the home came back to her in her memories. The oddly shaped entrance hall, made so that it could snake around the shower in the next room over, that she could not find a better spot for. The repeated cheap painting plastered on every wall, as it was the most cost-effective way to increase the mood of her My Sims as much as possible. The stairs to the basement clipping through the stairs to the first floor because... Wait, that was not right. She looked down the hall, past the open front door, at the mismatch of glitched and intersecting stairs, which somehow went from the ground floor to both the basement and the first floor while passing through each other. Everything in the house was as she remembered it, but at the same time, more strange glitchy details started to stand out. The broken stairs, one of the paintings flickering in and out of the wall it hung on, and a strange haze of censored pixels floating in the air somehow, where she knew the shower would be on the other side of the wall, and yet somehow visible to her here. Walking through the house, more and more details stood out, and her initial feelings of nostalgia turned to disquiet. It almost felt like somebody had come through here with a hammer to vandalize the house, but instead of breaking the physical material, it was the very structure of the world that was breaking. Moving from room to room, it became clear that this was not the beacon of hope she had thought it to be. There were too many mixed-up memories here, where none of them quite lined up with what she was seeing, and the oppressive silence was only broken by her own breathing and footsteps, as well as that creaking. She froze. That creaking was a new sound, wasn't it? So hard to think clearly, and now she began to wonder if maybe there was something in this house with her. Maybe it was time to get out of here, if there was nothing here to help her. Retracing her steps, she made her way back through the house, eyes only for the front door, all else ignored. It was then that she put her foot through the cat. The cat fizzled and hissed as her foot passed through it, the sudden noise making her leap in the air in surprise, her limbs flailing as she landed on her back and scrabbled backwards to get away from the new unknown. Despite all this flailing and noise, though, the cat did not seem to care and just sat there staring into the wall, not responding to the rude intrusion of the foot through its space. She sat on the floor, back to the wall as she fought to control her breathing, eyes wide, staring at the fuzzy and glitching cat that was now sitting in the middle of the floor in front of her. It had not been there before, and did not seem to want to give her any attention. The ginger tone of its blocky fur crackled, and occasionally lost all colour as the strange, square sparks of light pulsed over it. Moments passed, and the lack of any further changes helped bring her pulse back down to a slightly more life-sustaining range. Slowly, she edged closer to the animal, fearful of what might happen, but drawing on her limited reserve of nerves that had not yet been completely overstrung. Hand reached out, inching closer and closer to the cat, until just before she could touch it, it moved. The instant reaction to the unexpected motion sent her leaping back into the wall again, though at least this time she managed to remain standing. Without moving its limbs, the cat slid across the floor, turned 90 degrees, and continued down the hall, into the bathroom. Through the closed door. She blinked, and again. The impossibility of it warring with the bizarre surroundings, and she just stared in confusion at the door. The creaking ceased as the cat disappeared, and slowly her curiosity overcame the fear when no further strange sights or sounds presented themselves. The door stood before her, as cheap and common as a door could be, and she reached out to it with one hand. At least she knew what to expect this time, and the door flipped open at the touch of her hand, just like it would in-game. On the other side, the strange bathroom layout was oddly comforting. Its strange shape was one that she had put together all those years ago. A pair of toilets was sitting directly opposite the door, with double sink units on either side, and stepping through the doorway she glimpsed the shower unit in its ill-fitting cubby, where she had to move the walls to get it in. In all honesty, if she rebuilt this house again, a more adult sense of design would not have allowed her to have done it this way, and she was sure it would be a more normal layout, rather than trying to be optimal to allow a full family of My Sims to go about their days with a single bathroom. Now she was in here though, it did confirm that the odd pixelization that she had been seeing through the walls was what she had expected it to be. Back in the game, anytime the shower was in use, it was covered to stop the players from seeing the naked bodies of the in-game characters. Now, for some reason, it was appearing constantly. It was probably because she had tried to modify the game when she was a child and broken something. Edging closer to the shower, she reached out, and at her touch, the door swung open and the water turned on. So far, so good. It was acting normally for a video game shower, even if it was strange to be touching it herself now. And the confirmation that there was no one in the shower was a very welcome thing. The shrill, badly digitized meow behind her caught her off guard and made her jump in surprise. This unfortunately meant she was now in the shower, and the pixelated water did a convincing job of feeling wet as it bounced off her skin. There was not much time to consider this sensation though, as instead of standing inside the shower, she found that its floor didn't seem to have any physical presence, and she began to plummet, slipping through the floor as if it was not there. The last thing she saw of her childhood My Sims house was the corrupted ginger cat and the kaleidoscopic eye fixed on her from the shadows under the toilet. Falling is such an interesting sensation.